once again welcome you to our study of the Bible, the Word in a Year. So this evening, we begin our study of the books of the New Testament. Last week, we ended our study of the books of the Old Testament with a study of the books of Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Well, tonight, we begin our study of the books of the New Testament. And we begin by looking at the Gospels. And the first four books in the New Testament, they're commonly referred to as the Gospels. And they're called Gospel because they mean good news. And they derive their name from the Greek word euangelion. And each of these books of the Gospels, it has an explicit purpose. And the purpose is to tell the story of Jesus. And although each book has the same purpose, each of the Gospels, it was penned under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit by a different author. And because of that, each author has a different tone and a different message, or even a different reason for writing. So what you see by reading through each of these books is that although they're telling a very similar story, they emphasize different aspects of Jesus' life and his ministry here on earth. And each author may even have a different audience in mind when they wrote their work. So there's four Gospels. There's Matthew, there's Mark, Luke, and also John. The first three on the list, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're commonly referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. And they have that name because they're often seen as sharing a great bit of common material between each of them. In other words, they have a number of similar stories or similar accounts with respect in relation to the life and the accounts of Jesus' life here on earth. John's Gospel, it's a bit different and it's a bit unique. It has its own voice. And it covers different material and events that the other three Gospels don't. So it's been suggested that the Synoptic Gospels, they may have shared a common source from which they derived at least some of their materials from. And often this is referred to as Q. So with that bit of background this evening, let's briefly review each of these books. The Gospel of Matthew, it's anonymous. But the earliest reliable tradition, it links it to Matthew, the tax collector. Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, whom Jesus called away from his tax collecting duties in order that he might follow him and be his disciple. So for roughly 30 or 40 years, the apostles, they had orally taught and passed down their eyewitness accounts of Jesus and also his teaching. But eventually they decided that these needed to be written down and also preserved for future generations. So each author, they will write to a different group of people in their writings, and they highlight different aspects of Jesus' life for that particular audience in which they're writing. So in Matthew's instance, he writes primarily to a Jewish audience. His intention is to highlight the fact that Jesus is the promised Messiah. He's that promised Messiah of the Old Testament. The prophets and the people of Israel, they had longed for this day, and Matthew wants to highlight that this day now has been fulfilled. So Matthew, he highlights three different key elements through his gospel. He highlights that Jesus is the Messiah from the line of David, that Jesus is a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and that Jesus is God with us, or in Hebrew, the word Emmanuel. The book of Matthew, it's set up in a way that has seven different sections. It's bookended by an introduction, and then finally a conclusion. And in between those parts, there's 5 sections, each of which conclude with a discourse, a sermon, if you will, of Jesus. Matthew's gospel, it contains the Sermon on the Mount. It's probably the most famous sermon of all of Jesus that we still have preserved today. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus instructs us on what it means to live as part of his kingdom. And I like to call it Jesus' kingdom manifesto. It's what it means to live in his kingdom, to be one of his disciples. Additionally, the final words of Matthew's gospel are Jesus' great commission statement. These words remind us of what we are to do as followers of Christ. We're to go out into all nations, teaching them about Jesus, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and making disciples of each and every one of them. It also contains an incredible reminder that Jesus will be with us always, even until the very end of the world. And this is a reminder that Jesus will always be with us up until the time that he finally returns to rejoin heaven and earth and usher in the fullness of God's kingdom. The next book, Mark. Mark's gospel it often reads as a TLDR, too long didn't read, right, of the others. But Mark's gospel is actually the earliest recorded writing of the life and works of Jesus. This book has been accredited to John Mark. He was an associate of Barnabas, who we'll talk about in the book of Acts, as well as an antagonist of sorts to the Apostle Paul. Mark may have had his rough edges, but eventually he reconciles with Paul, and he becomes a minister in the early church, helping to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. Mark was also a close partner with Peter, and it has been theorized that Mark's account, it's actually Peter's gospel. In other words, Mark is writing the stories that Peter told him regarding Jesus. And the ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and all of the memories of Peter, and he shaped them into this account in this gospel. Mark's gospel, it opens by stating his intent that this is the good news about Jesus, who is the Messiah, the Son of God. And this is the only time that Mark states who he thinks Jesus is. But the rest of this book, he hopes to influence you by putting Jesus' actions and his words in front of you. And the big idea of Mark's gospel is that Jesus is the suffering, crucified Messiah and Son of God. And it's through God's love and kingdom that they're revealed through Jesus. That's how God expresses his love to us as humans. There's 3 parts to Mark's gospel, and each has a separate location. The first is set in Galilee. The second is Jesus traveling. And the third and the final act, it's set in Jerusalem. And each of these sections has a repeated theme in which we see that Jesus is the Messiah. And although Jesus tells and he shows that he is the Messiah, throughout this entire account, his disciples, they become confused. And their confusion is due to how Jesus revealed himself as the Messiah. Many Jews, they believed that the Messiah would reveal himself as the conqueror to take down the Roman Empire, and then to in turn liberate Israel and Jerusalem. But when Jesus came as the humble, suffering servant, they were a bit confused. The actions and the prophecies correlated, but where was this kingdom at that was promised? The problem is that many of them, they forgot the prophecies of Isaiah, where Isaiah stated that the suffering servant would come humbly and suffer for our sake. The Gospel of Mark, it ends with a question for the reader. Will we go and tell the good news of Jesus, or will we run away? Luke's gospel has a clear author. It's the physician Luke. It's stated at the beginning. And Luke was a companion of Paul, and he was most likely Paul's personal physician. So Luke's gospel is actually part 1 of a 2-part work that includes the book of Acts. We'll talk about in the next session. Luke's attention to detail, it's noticeable as you work through his gospel. In addition to using the reference material that was available in his day, Luke also used as many eyewitness accounts as possible so that he could produce an orderly, as he calls it, account for whoever was reading this. For Luke, the story of Jesus, it wasn't just history. It was the fulfillment of the long covenant story of God and Israel. And then also on a larger scale, God and the entire world. Luke's gospel was meant to be accessible to more than just Jewish readers. His intention was to write a gospel for the Gentiles as well, the non-Jews. For Luke, Jesus was not the king that Israel expected, but his suffering, death, and resurrection, it showed the true power that he had and that was found in his love for us. His gospel reads like a detailed account of Jesus' life here on earth. In fact, you will find some detailed accounts in Luke's gospel that are only found there. Being that this was written for more of a Gentile audience than the other gospels, Luke also includes a number of references to Jesus reaching out to those who were maybe deemed outcasts in Jewish society. He reached out to those who were maybe looked down upon. So for Jews, Gentiles themselves would have been considered outcasts as well. So Luke's purpose and his point is to include as many references to Jesus reaching out to the outcast of Jewish society in order that he might point out that Jesus desires for all to come and be part of his kingdom. Finally, John's gospel is one that bears the least similarities to the others. There has been some debate about which John actually wrote this book. Was it John, the disciple of Jesus, or a different John who lived in Jerusalem and was later called or known as John the Elder? Many attribute this still to John, the disciple, the apostle of Jesus, due to the repeated reference to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And I've always thought that this phrase, it always struck me as a bit braggadocious, right? You know, it's a bit a pompous statement that maybe John would be making here, right? The way that it's translated for us here in English. You know, oh, Jesus loved me the most. But here we find that the importance of understanding Greek, and a better translation of this phrase is probably the disciple whom Jesus kept on loving. In other words, in spite of John's personal mistakes, his shortcomings, whatever they may be, Jesus kept on loving him. And for me, when I read that phrase, I'm so thankful that Jesus keeps on loving me also whenever I falter and whenever I fail. This gospel embodies eyewitness testimony that has a clear purpose that's stated at the end. Its purpose is to point people that they might believe that Jesus is Messiah, and in doing so, that they might have life in his name. One of the unique aspects of John's gospel is the opening introduction, which is so beautifully penned and crafted. It's a statement about who Jesus was and who he is. It speaks of Jesus in eternity past, how he existed since the foundations of the world. He's the eternal word, or logos. And additionally, we find the 7 I am declarations of Jesus in this gospel as well, and only here. There's several miracles that are mentioned in this book. In a particular section, they all accumulate in the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead. The big idea from this book is that John believes that Jesus is alive and real, and that his message can change the lives of individuals and the entire world forever. So that's our study of the Gospels. And in the next session, we'll jump over to the book of Acts. I hope you have a great week.